This is joint work with Sophie Bade from Royal Holloway, University of London. And we're going to talk about strategyproofness. So when I'm going to say dominant strategyproofness in this talk, I'm going to mean dominant strategy incentive compatibility. So usually strategyproofness is defined as no incentive to misreport information to the mechanism, and is arguably the most basic objective mechanism design, setting apart from algorithm design or from protocol design, etc., and guarantees that players truthfully reveal their private information to the mechanism. Or rather, it guarantees that if players are truthful, that they are not harmed by that. That actually for players to act truthfully, the mechanism doesn't only have to be strategy proof, the players must understand that it is in their best interest to reveal the true preferences. They must really understand that the mechanism is strategy proof. And strategyproofness in general is the property of social choice functions. We're going to use that term very generally to mean maps from preference profiles to outcomes. So outcomes could be allocations, but they also could be monetary payments and etc. And has observed that in experiments that the way in which a given social choice function is implemented affects the amount of participants who try to game the mechanism. So for example, the following social choice function in the context of a single item auction, award the item to the highest bidder and charge them the second highest bid, is strategy proof. Nonetheless, it has been observed again and again in the lab and in the field that when used in ascending auction to implement this social choice function, many more participants are truthful than when you use, for example, a single bid sealed auction. And this is intuitively consistent with a more complicated kind of explanation for the latter, right? Because in an ascending auction, you're just like, okay, why not stay in? You can always drop out before the counter passes your value, so you're never going to have negative utility. With sealed bid second price auction, it's kind of like, so imagine that you're the highest bidder, so there's nothing you can do to increase your utility. Now imagine that you're not the highest bidder, so there's like a contingent if this then reasoning that's going around that's like more harder, takes many more words to explain. So a question that's been going on for a long, that's been in the air for a long time is what formally makes ascending auctions more obviously strategy proof than sealed bid second price auctions. And 2 years ago, Shengwu Li, who he was at Stanford, now he's at Harvard, he really gave a formal definition of what he proposes to be this difference. He called it obviously strategy proofness. And in a precise sense, this definition that we'll see in a second captures the strategy proofness of mechanisms that can be proved without this kind of contingent reasoning. If the others do this, then I'm fine. If the others do this, then I'm fine. There have been quite a few follow-ups by now, more than 10 follow-ups. We'll see a review at the end of the talk, and it's very advanced stages of revise and resubmit at AR, so it's gotten really a lot of traction in the econ community. So obvious strategy proofness in a nutshell. So as we said, a social choice function is a map from preference profiles to outcomes. That's analogous, if you wish, to a game in strategic form. And we'll say that an implementation of a social choice function is like a game in extensive form. It's a decision tree, if you wish, where each node is labeled by an agent. And each agent at the nodes that he is responsible for, he will choose whether to choose which of the edges according to his preferences. So, for example, here we have player A, so say that his truth right now is this, and we want to ask whether it's strategy proof or obviously strategy proof to go to the right and not to deviate to some other edge. So to check strategy proofness, right, we've all done that like a million times. Note that player B here is in the same information set, so he'll either go left in both or right in both. And since the truth is like over object here, I've marked for your viewing enjoyment his first best, second best, third best, and fourth best of agent A. So to check strategy proofness, as I said, we've done this a million times already. If B goes to the left, then yeah, A is better off telling the truth. He'll get his third rather than fourth choice. And if B goes to the right, then player A is still better off telling the truth. He'll get his first rather than second choice. So this tree is telling the truth for this type of player A is strategy proof. Nonetheless, definition of obvious strategy proofness requires that at each node, the adversarial outcome when A acts truthfully, so the worst case when A acts truthfully would be no less better off than the best case when A deviates. So like anything that could happen when A acts truthfully has to be at least as good as anything that could happen when A deviates. So let's check that. So if A tells the truth, the worst case that could happen is X. And if A deviates, the best thing that could happen is Y. And here A actually prefers Y to X. So unless he has the ability to say, if B does this, then something. If B does this, then something, so we're overall okay. If he can't do this kind of contingent reasoning, he can't convince himself that this is strategy proof. So in this case, it's not obviously strategy proof. That's the definition. And if it helps anyone, this is equivalent to having a dominant strategy in the perfect information extensive game where this information set is shattered. So solution concept are a means to an end. Usually we want like strategy proofness or some other form of strategy proofness. But on the other hand, we always some kind of desiderata like freeness or maximization of welfare, maximization of revenue, etc. So in this talk, we will focus on one of these desiderata, so Pareto optimality. And in a very general sense, an outcome is Pareto optimal if no other outcome is weakly preferred by all agents and strictly preferred by one agent, and we would like a mechanism to always generate Pareto optimal outcomes. So we're going to look at Pareto optimal and obviously strategy proof mechanisms. The caveat is that even for like vanilla strategy proof, if you combine it with Pareto optimality, there is a very strong impossibility theorem, very celebrated by Gibbard and Satterthwaite, saying that generally when agents hold any preference over a set of at least 3 outcomes, then anything that's strategy proof and Pareto optimal is in fact dictatorial. So in order to look for, so a lot of the work actually in mechanism design aims at getting, in some sense, getting around this impossibility result by looking at very special domains of preferences. So the 3 textbook grand success stories that I guess everyone here has more or less seen that show how to get really nice non-dictatorial mechanisms that are strategy proof and Pareto optimal for specific domains. So for single peaked preferences, there's sometimes called voting or facility location. We get median voting, which is a very useful mechanism, very nice mechanism. For quasi-linear preferences, when there is a numeraire, we can do VCG to get all kinds of fabulous things. And for object assignment, if you have many, many objects and you want to assign one object to each agent, we get, for example, top trading cycles, which is a very nice Pareto efficient mechanism, and strategy proof. And Lee actually showed that in the very general case, top trading cycles is not obvious strategy proof, but maybe other mechanisms are. So to find Pareto optimal and obvious strategy proof implementable social choice rules, that is that we have an obvious strategy proof mechanism that implements them, we turn to these 3 textbook escape routes from Gibbard-Satterthwaite and ask, do these domains still provide escape routes from Gibbard-Satterthwaite even when strategy proofness is strengthened to obvious strategy proofness? And in this talk, we're going to completely characterize the obviously strategy proof and Pareto optimal mechanisms for each of the above 3 domains. And we're going to do that for 2 reasons. First of all, to see whether we uncover any useful mechanisms whose strategy proofness is very easy to explain. And the second reason, and arguably the more important reason, is to effect an integrated through examination of the strengths and weaknesses of the definition of obvious strategy proofness itself. We're going to see whether it gives us results that we would intuitively call, colloquially call obviously strategy proof. Before we dive into the specific cases, I should know that anyone here, if you're interested in obvious strategy proofness, the main thing is that direct revelation does not apply since we're talking about the tree structure, not only the strategic form. So we have a bunch of very general purpose tools that we call gradual revelation. So if anyone here is interested in obvious strategy proofness, I urge you to take a look at these. It may save you some time. That being said, their instantiation to each of these domains requires quite a lot of work. So let's summarize the results. So we have our 3 settings here. We will list here the characterization of what's obviously strategy proof and Pareto optimal. And this very arguable and subjective column will say whether we think that colloquially this kind of captures what we could call obviously strategy proof, like in an informal sense. So for single peak preferences, we characterize this set of obvious strategy proof and Pareto optimal mechanisms as what we call dictatorships with safeguards against extremism. We'll see the definition in a moment. And these are, in some sense, plausible mechanisms. So there's mainly a dictator, but if he wants to implement too extreme policies, then there are safeguards in place. So I mean, you could actually see that happening in some cases in real life. They're kind of simple to describe. The nice thing there is that when I'm going to describe them to you, it may not be obvious to everyone in the audience that they're strategy proof. But when I will give you the alternate description of the obvious strategy proof tree, hopefully it will be much easier to see immediately that they are strategy proof. So here, obvious strategy proofness really does fulfill its goal. It identifies simple mechanisms, and presenting them using the obviously strategy proof tree makes them actually easier to understand. So for quasi-linear bidders, so we take the most simple thing you could think of. Well, for one good, we know that an ascending auction is obviously strategy proof. Sheng-Wu Li showed that, actually defined the concept to have this property. So we're going to look at the second simplest thing you could think about: two bidders, two goods, and additive valuations. And we show that nothing is obviously strategy proof in Pareto optimal. So the nice thing of having an ascending auction for a single item, that's like the more or less the limit of what you can do with the obvious strategy proofness when you have money. And to drive home the restrictiveness, I would ask you to think about the following scenario. Say that I am to, so everything's additive, so we can basically decompose an auction into an auction for the first item and an auction for the second item. And I would ask you to think about the scenario of me participating in two auctions. One of them today, the other one next month. They're going to be in different cities. I'm going to be the only bidder in both of them. And no one in the second auction is going to know anything about what happened in the first auction. They may know that it existed, but they wouldn't know what people actually played. In that case, you would imagine that since, well, I would colloquially say that since for each auction by itself, it's an ascending auction, and it's obviously strategy proof to drop when the counter reaches my value, I would argue that colloquially, the two auctions together are also obviously strategy proof. But the definition actually doesn't give that, because when I reason about what I'm going to do in the first auction, I actually consider the entire tree of the second auction. So I'm going to say the worst thing, if I bid truthfully in the first auction, is that people bid very high in the second auction and I get nothing. The best case, if I deviate in the first auction, is that actually everyone bids zero in the second auction and I get the item for free. So
you have a budget constraint?
No, I don't have any budget. It's really separable. It really decomposes, and this definition of obviously strategy proof does not decompose. So I'm going to claim here that the definition overshoots. It's too strong. Finally, for object assignment, we characterize the set of obviously strategy proof and Pareto optimal mechanisms as what we call sequential butter with lurkers. And I'm not going to give you the definition here, but I'm going to say that it's really, really involved. And these mechanisms, many of them, are not obvious even to describe, let alone to understand why they're strategy proof. It's a very long proof, and description is more than a full LaTeX page of the general class. And the mechanics that come into play there are considerably richer and more diverse than previously demonstrated. It's much more than something ascending or dictatorship or something like that. So for that, I'm going to claim that definition undershoots. It needs some kind of refinement. So the takeaway from all of this is that in natural sense, obvious strategy proofness is neither too strong nor too weak. It's very good for some domains. For some domains, it's too strong. For some domains, it's too weak. And in some case, we would advocate looking for a definition that's not simply a weakening or a strengthening, but something that's incomparable. But that being said, it's very good that we now have a formal benchmark to go against. And it's very good, I find it very good that finally the discussion of what obvious means has been moved to a formal playground rather than a hand-wavy playground. So before the end of my talk, I'm going to explain to you our mechanisms, the nice mechanism that I spoke about for single peak preferences. So the setting is that there's all of the outcomes called policies. You could think about like different people in government or whatever are on the line. And each agent has single peak preferences. That is, he has a peak that he likes the most. And as things move away from that peak, he likes them less and less. So for this setting, there are many unanimous. Unanimous means that if everyone has the same peak, then that peak is chosen. There are many unanimous, even Pareto optimal. Pareto optimality is stronger than unanimity. Strategy-proof social choice functions, such as median voting. There's very massive literature, much of which is due to Hervé, who's sitting here. And but unfortunately, median voting, as we show, is not obviously strategy-proof implementable. There is no game tree, extensive form tree whatsoever that gives an obviously strategy-proof implementation. And we ask, are there any other mechanisms that yield a obviously strategy-proof implementation? So the general mechanism would be dictatorship with safeguards against extremism. So we'll call one of the agents the dictator, even though he's not a dictator in the sense of deciding everything. And we're going to call every other agent a safeguard. And every safeguard has, this is part of the mechanism description, not the preferences, he has Li and Ri, two policies. And it will be possible to him, though he doesn't have to do it, but he could veto anything to the left of Li and anything to the right of Ri. So here's the set of policies, and if player 2 has Li and Ri2, that he could veto anything here and anything here. And agent 3 may have L3 and R3 here, so he could veto anything here and anything here if he wishes, etc. And we require, this is still part of the mechanism description, that there be at least one policy that no agent can veto. In this case, it's 1 and 2, right? Actually, minus 1 till 2. And here's how the mechanism progresses. So first, each safeguard, agent who is not agent 1, the dictator, chooses which policies to veto. So say that, I'm going to describe the strategy-proof strategies now. So say that agent 2 has his peak here, so he would veto everything outside, everything that he can, since his peak is in the interval that he cannot veto. And say that agent 3 has the peak outside that interval, so he's going to veto anything that he can here, but anything after his peak here. And finally, the dictator would choose among the remaining policies, so no one has vetoed minus 2 to 2. So the dictator, say that his peak is minus 4, he would choose the best policy according to his preferences. So this is the mechanism, and our theorem is that a social choice function for the domain of single peak preferences is unanimous and obviously strategy-proof and implementable if and only if it is a dictatorship with safeguards against extremism, and any such social choice function is moreover Pareto optimal. So we assumed only unanimity. Obviously, Strategyproofness gave us Pareto optimality for free, but at this point, it shouldn't be very clear to anyone in the audience why actually the strategies that I described are strategy-proof, are the strategy-proof strategies. So I'm going to give you now a different description that follows along the obviously strategy-proof tree, and hopefully that would clear everything up without a word of proof. So we have the same setup, and here's how the mechanism progresses now. This is going to be strategically equivalent. So it's going to be an ascending style implementation, but in more than one direction. So the dictator chooses, first of all, either an unvetoable policy or left or right. So either minus 1, 0, 1, or 2, or say he says go to the left or go to the right. In this case, his peak is here, so we would say go to the left. Now the mechanism follows in that direction, and at any time, any in effect safeguard or the dictator may decide to stop. So here we would ask L3 if it would like to stop. So his peak is here, so he says no, go on. L2 would actually, this is agent 3. Agent 2 would actually like to stop because his peak has already been here, but he can't because he's not in effect yet. We haven't passed his L2 yet. So the mechanism goes on here. We ask the dictator, he doesn't want to stop yet. We ask agent 2, he would like to stop, but no one asks him because he's not in effect yet. Agent 3, would you like to stop? Yes, he would. And the outcome is minus 2. This is exactly strategically equivalent to what we had before. Hopefully, the strategy proofness of this is much clearer to everyone in the audience. So in this specific case, obvious strategy proofness helps us identify useful mechanisms and also a clear way of presenting them in a way that's more transparent. I will finish here. This is a literature review, shameless plug for a paper of mine with Itaya Schlagi that analyzes which profiles of preference, which priority structures enable an obvious strategy proof implementation in stable matchings. And so this is some other literature on this, previous and following to our work. And I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.